NATO ministers meeting in Brussels say the alliance is testing new drone defenses on its eastern flank. They're designed to counter threats from Russia after a series of drone incursions that NATO has linked to Moscow.
Russia is escalating its provocations of NATO, sending fighter jets into alliance airspace over Estonia and a swarm of drones over Poland. And so the routine meeting of NATO defense ministers takes on new urgency. The alliance must improve its air defense, especially in countering enemy drones.
NATO will implement a number of additional counter-drone measures that will build on and expand and accelerate our ability to counter drones.
Britain's Defense Secretary John Healey said the Kremlin must be left in no doubt that if NATO is threatened, it will act.
Putin's incursions into NATO territory are reckless, dangerous and totally unacceptable. Deliberate or not, Putin is watching what we do.
To better protect NATO frontline states, Germany is also increasing its commitment.
We will contribute with patrol flights to protect the eastern flank. And the head of my Air Force tells me he is very proud to be able to say that the largest commitment of a European NATO state to protect Allied airspace comes from his Air Force.
But Ukraine has no such shield and continues to suffer Russian bombardments with increasing severity. This winter, as in previous years, Moscow is primarily targeting the energy infrastructure. That makes further arms deliveries to Ukraine all the more urgent. NATO's European members have agreed to buy from the US those weapons Ukraine has identified as the most important. But Rutte had to acknowledge just over half of the 32 allies have now committed to doing so. And just a day before this NATO meeting, new research showed European arms deliveries to Ukraine are actually down more than 40% since July.
Rose Gottemoeller is a former NATO Deputy Secretary General and joins me now. Good to have you back on the show, Rose. NATO Secretary General Rutte insists the alliance can defend all of its territory. But after last month's airspace incursions, one has to wonder, are they not just playing catch-up?
Well, I have been very proud of the way NATO has been responding to the air incursions and pulling together capabilities and forces from across the alliance in order to be able to respond as they have in, for example, Baltic air policing now for many years, repelling incursions by Russian aircraft. So I've been proud about how they've responded, but the question now is, do they have the right capabilities? And Ukraine is showing the way in the necessity of defending against drones. And so, of course, all eyes are on Ukraine and whether Ukraine can help NATO to learn about how to defend against drones. Ukraine has had military experts in Denmark, for example, training Danish military in how to repel drones. And so it's an interesting conundrum now, of course, as you just reported, Ukraine under tremendous pressure from the Russian Federation, repeated strikes, including on a hospital yesterday. But at the same time, it is leading the way in helping NATO understand what the threats of the future are going to be.
Yeah, we're seeing NATO kind of bracing for this new threat, and then the EU is also working in parallel on its drone wall. And there is some concern as to whether or not the EU is treading on NATO's toes in its attempt to achieve more sovereignty from the EU there. Are they really working hand in hand, as Rutte says?
I believe so, yes. This is an old worry, a very old worry, including from when I was DSG now 7-8 years ago. But I do believe that NATO and the EU have developed a much better modus vivendi, a much better way of working together now. And the EU is indeed focusing on the acquisition of new military capabilities and how, in particular, European innovation companies can become more involved, as well as the traditional defense industries, which must now modernize their production capabilities and take into account new innovation as well. So I think it's a moment of opportunity for the European Union in terms of defense modernization. And I don't see any necessary reason why the EU and NATO should be tripping over each other as they try to enhance Europe's defenses.
Germany has announced it will beef up its presence on the EU's and NATO's eastern flank with fighter jets set to be stationed in Poland. How much of a deterrent could that be?
I think we've seen examples recently even of Russia being deterred once NATO shows up in force. And the example I like to give is of the cable cutting in the Baltic Sea. Now, of course, it's hard to attribute every action in cable cutting to the Russian Federation, but we have our suspicions. And as soon as France showed up in a NATO operation to really help to defend the cables, communication cables in the Baltic Sea, and to also investigate what's going on there and help with the repair work, somehow the cable cutting stopped. So I do think when NATO shows up in force, that is a deterrent. There's no question about it. Once again, though, F-35s are not the best way to defend against drones. So NATO has some hard work to do with the EU to get better defenses at less cost.
Yeah. You mentioned Ukraine earlier, and aid to Ukraine was, of course, also discussed there in Brussels. We did see some major pledges, but overall military aid has dwindled significantly. What are the reasons for that?
I think we're seeing the cost of the U.S. really dropping its assistance programs to Ukraine now. The U.S., despite the very real assistance that the European NATO countries have given, and even Canada, which has lagged in the past but is now stepping forward with more assistance, the United States gave the vast amount of military assistance to Ukraine under the Biden administration, and President Trump is simply not willing to do that anymore. Now they have this new program wherein NATO member states from Europe, the Canadians, can buy U.S. military equipment, weapon systems, and provide them to Ukraine. I hope that the lag we're seeing is simply the fact that there's been a transition going from the U.S. dominating the assistance to this new kind of approach. And so maybe some natural lag. In the first months of the year, the numbers were up. And I really appreciate the work of the Kiel Institute for putting these numbers together on such a timely basis. But I'm hoping that this is a temporary lag and that numbers will indeed pick up following this defense ministerial and the pledges that have been made.
There are some discussions surrounding this new modus operandi. The U.S. Secretary of Defense came to Brussels with somewhat of a sales pitch, it sounded like. He urged NATO members to buy more U.S. weapons to provide to Ukraine, and this entire scheme has been criticized. I'd like to get your view before we let you go. Is the U.S. now making money from the war in Ukraine?
Well, someone would argue that the U.S. is always making money from its military assistance as well as its cooperation with the NATO allies to provide them for their military requirements. The U.S., of course, is very active selling military equipment and material weapon systems around the world. I cannot say, I haven't done the calculations, how much money it's making out of the war in Ukraine. So I'm not going to say that that's an accurate statement. But because you have to balance it with what has been given in assistance, again, throughout this now over 3-year-old war. And some of it has been donated, some of it has been purchased. So I'm not going to say that the U.S. has been making money out of the war in Ukraine, but I will say that a huge amount of equipment has come from the United States, either through donation, assistance, or sales.
That was former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller. Thank you so much. Always great to have you on the show.
My pleasure.
We can get more from DW's Teri Schultz, who's at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Teri, so this contribution, increased contribution from Germany, is obviously coming at a time of heightened concern over these Russian provocations. Tell us what more the alliance is planning on doing to boost security on the eastern flank.
That's right. Germany was among the nations that scrambled after this large swarm of drones came into Poland just over a month ago. And the Eurofighters were used at that time, as were particularly the Dutch F-35s, which actually shot down a couple of those drones, the first time NATO aircraft have done that. And after that, Eastern Sentry was set up to provide a more longer-term shield for these eastern flank countries that after that, in fact, saw further provocations, a drone into Romania just a couple days later, and then 3 Russian MiGs flying in Estonian airspace for 12 minutes. So Eastern Sentry is set up to deter that, also to clarify the rules of engagement that countries have for just what would happen if, for example, some jets or drones actually provided a threat to NATO countries. Now, that requires a lot of discussion because different countries have different rules. So that's some of what's happening here today. At the same time, NATO is setting up other counter-drone technologies, and the European Union in parallel is doing the same thing. Now, both organizations say that they're coordinating closely and there won't be any duplication, and that this is all set up basically just to better fortify the eastern flank of both the EU and NATO. And we'll hear more about that, in fact, from the European Union tomorrow when they roll out what they call their defense roadmap.
And aid for Ukraine was also discussed, I believe, in Brussels today. What additional kind of aid can Ukraine hope for?
Certainly, and that meeting is going on right now, chaired by German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius and UK Defense Secretary John Healey, who took over leading this group from the United States when the Trump administration came in and no longer wanted to chair it. Now, what happens here is that some 50 countries, far beyond just the NATO allies, get together monthly and decide what contributions they can provide to Ukraine. At the moment of particular interest is a new program set up in August by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte with the Trump administration, and that prioritizes what Ukraine has said it needs most urgently into packages that are worth some $500 million. And that has the European allies then buying weapons directly from the United States to send to Ukraine as quickly as possible. The U.S. isn't funding any of these packages, but European allies see that as a way to keep the U.S. engaged in arming Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Rutte today said that he was very pleased that the number of allies participating in these packages has gone up from 6 to over half the allies. That's more than 16. But clearly they'd like to see more countries putting more money into this, because at the same time we see that aid to Ukraine has dropped more than 40% since the beginning of the year. So there's a lot of work to do with allies to keep Ukraine better in the fight against Russia.
Now, also in Brussels today, the Pentagon chief, Pete Hegseth, give us a sense, Teri, of relations between the US and NATO these days.
Well, certainly there's no longer the kind of tension we used to have before these NATO meetings when you wouldn't know whether Pete Hegseth was going to come and say the U.S. was no longer committed to Article 5. Now he has restated that today more than once. We just heard from allies coming out of the meeting that Pete Hegseth did say that the United States remains committed to NATO, remains committed to this bedrock of collective security. So that certainly is reassuring. And we really saw that turn in the Trump administration at NATO's June summit, where President Trump said he realized it wasn't a ripoff to help European allies protect their own territory. So that kind of tension is gone. I'm sure they would like to see more support. They would like to see the U.S. putting more money into arming Ukraine. But I think people are pretty satisfied with the level of relations right now. And certainly that low point of relations between the Trump administration and NATO seems to have passed.
DW's Teri Schultz reporting from Brussels. Teri, thank you.